Imagine a world where your heart shatters not once, but many times before you even reach middle age. A world where the laughter of a child is a fleeting song, and the silence that follows is a constant, cold companion. What if the very act of bringing life into the world was a gamble with odds stacked terrifyingly against you, and against the tiny being you cherished? What was it like for mothers in 1085, staring into the abyss of child mortality, day after agonizing day? Number 1. The scourge of epidemic diseases. In the year 1085, across the scattered hamlets and nascent towns of Europe, a mother's greatest fear was often an invisible enemy. It was not a charging knight or a bandit lurking in the woods, but a microscopic invader that swept through communities with brutal efficiency. These were the epidemic diseases, silent and relentless, leaving a trail of sorrow and devastation in their wake. Picture a small village nestled by a winding river, its homes made of wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw. Life here was already hard, dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. Then an illness would creep in, perhaps brought by a traveling merchant or a returning pilgrim, and suddenly the air would grow thick with dread. Measles, a seemingly common childhood illness today, was a terrifying death sentence in 1085. Its characteristic rash, fever, and cough were just the beginning. Without any true understanding of contagion, villagers believed it was a punishment from higher powers, a malevolent spirit, or simply bad air. When little Ilara, barely 5 summers old, developed the telltale spots, her mother, Isolde, felt a familiar knot of icy fear clench in her stomach. Isolde had already buried 2 babes in their infancy, victims of the flux, as they called dysentery, a terrible affliction that wrung the life out of tiny bodies with relentless purging. In time, Isolde's heart had cracked a little more, leaving her with a constant ache beneath her ribs. Now Ilara, so full of life, so quick to giggle at the playful antics of the village dog, was burning with fever. The village elder, a woman with a kind face and hands gnarled by years of toil, offered poultices of herbs and whispered prayers, but the fever climbed higher, the rash spread, and Ilara's breathing grew shallow. Isolde stayed by her side day and night, moistening her parched lips, singing lullabies she had sung to her own lost babes, hoping against hope that this bright, spirited girl would be spared. But the unseen killer was relentless. The light in Ilara's eyes dimmed, and one morning, as the first rays of dawn touched the thatched roof, her small body grew still. Isolde's scream was a raw, primal sound that echoed through the quiet home, a testament to the devastating power of an illness that nobody understood, nobody could truly fight. Dysentery, or the bloody flux, was another common executioner of the young. In a world without clean water systems, where human and animal waste often commingled with sources of drinking water, it was a constant threat. Summer, ironically, could be the most dangerous time, as the heat provided fertile ground for the bacteria that caused the disease to multiply. Imagine a crowded, bustling marketplace, the air thick with the smell of livestock and wood smoke. Children, with their innate curiosity, would play in the dirt, their hands finding their way to their mouths, carrying the invisible agents of disease. When a wave of dysentery swept through, it often claimed multiple children from the same family. For a mother like Aveline, who lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of a growing town, the arrival of the flux was like a chilling prophecy. Twin sons, Thomas and Philip, were robust and lively, chasing geese in the yard, their laughter a daily balm to her weary soul. Then came the stomach cramps, the fever, the relentless diarrhea that sapped their strength, turning their rosy cheeks pale and their bright eyes hollow. Aveline watched helplessly as her sons wasted away, their tiny bodies shriveling, despite her desperate attempts to give them sips of watered-down honey and prayers whispered with trembling lips. She felt the gnawing guilt of not knowing what to do, of not being able to magically heal her children, of seeing the life drain from their small frames. When Thomas died, she clutched Philip even tighter, willing her love to protect him, but the disease showed no mercy. A few days later, Philip followed his brother. Aveline's grief was not just for the loss of her children, but for the loss of her own future, her hopes, her very purpose. Twin graves in the churchyard were stark monuments to the power of unseen killers, leaving mothers like Aveline utterly devastated, their hearts forever marked by the cruel hand of epidemic disease. Smallpox, with its disfiguring pustules and high mortality rate, especially among the young, also stalked the land. It left survivors scarred for life, a constant reminder of its passage, but for many children, it was a swift and agonizing end. Diphtheria, tuberculosis, even influenza, in a time without modern medicine, were formidable foes. Each outbreak was a lottery of life and death, and children, with their developing immune systems and often weaker constitutions, were the most vulnerable targets. Mothers lived with a constant, simmering anxiety, a fear that was never truly absent, even in moments of joy. Every cough, every fever, every unexplained rash sent a bolt of terror through their hearts. The helplessness was crushing. There were no doctors in the modern sense, no antibiotics, no vaccines. There were only traditional healers, herbal remedies, and desperate prayers offered to saints. These unseen enemies, tiny but deadly, wrought widespread devastation, tearing through families, leaving mothers with empty arms and hollowed-out souls, their lives forever shadowed by the epidemics that stole their future, one precious child at a time. The landscape of 1085 was not just shaped by fields and rivers, but by the countless tiny graves that spoke volumes of a world where disease held dominion over the most innocent lives. Number 2, malnutrition and famine's cruel grip. Beyond the invisible enemies of disease, there was a more tangible, yet equally insidious, threat that devoured the young, the brutal reality of malnutrition and famine. In 1085, life was inherently precarious. Agriculture was largely subsistence-based, meaning families grew just enough to feed themselves if the weather held. A harsh winter, a prolonged drought, or excessive rains could mean the ruin of a harvest, pushing entire communities to the brink of starvation. For a mother, watching her child sicken and waste away from lack of food was a particular kind of torture, a slow, agonizing process that gnawed at her very being. Consider the family of Agnes, living in a small farming settlement dependent on the annual grain harvest. For months, the summer had been unusually dry. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth into a hard, cracked shell. Crops, which should have been tall and green, withered and turned yellow, their stalks stunted, their heads barren. Agnes had 3 children: 8-year-old Matthew, a sturdy boy who loved to help his father in the fields, 5-year-old Marguerite, a playful girl who chased butterflies, and baby Cecile, still nursing at her breast, plump and rosy-cheeked. As the harvest approached, the grim reality became clear. There would be little grain, few vegetables, and the family's meager stores from the previous year were already dwindling. First, the meals became smaller, then less frequent. Bread, once a staple, became a luxury, replaced by roots foraged from the woods, or thin, watery gruel made from whatever scraps could be found. Agnes, ever the protector, tried to give her children the largest portions, often going hungry herself, her stomach aching with emptiness, but her heart aching more for her children. The effects of malnutrition were slow but devastating. Children, with their rapidly developing bodies, needed constant nourishment, and without it, they quickly succumbed. Matthew, once so energetic, became listless, his eyes dull, his movements slow. His ribs began to show, stark lines against his thin chest. Marguerite, who used to sing as she played, now sat quietly, her usually bright eyes sunken, her skin pale and papery. Agnes saw the signs, the wasting away, the quiet despair in their faces. She tried to find more food, scouring the hedgerows for berries, digging for any edible root, but the land was bare. Desperation was palpable in the village, as families traded their meager possessions for a handful of oats, or left their homes in search of food in other, equally afflicted, regions. The strength of the adults ebbed, but for the children, it was a death sentence. Baby Cecile, so vibrant just weeks before, began to sicken. Agnes's own milk, once abundant, became thin and insufficient as her body struggled to sustain itself. Cecile cried weakly, her tiny fists clenching, her skin losing its softness, becoming dry and loose. Agnes cradled her, weeping silent tears, feeling the terrible weight of her inability to provide. She knew deep in her gut that Cecile was slipping away, not from fever or rash, but from the simple, brutal lack of sustenance. She watched, tormented, as her youngest faded, her cries growing fainter until they ceased altogether. The small, still body in her arms was a testament to the unforgiving cruelty of hunger. Agnes felt a profound emptiness, a deep, crushing sorrow that transcended mere grief. It was the devastation of knowing she could not protect her child from the most fundamental threat to life, the devastation of watching her child starve. The ripple effect of famine was equally brutal. Even if a child survived the initial starvation, their weakened immune system made them incredibly susceptible to the diseases that always follow. A minor cold could turn into pneumonia, a scratch into a fatal infection. Malnourished children were too weak to fight off even the most common ailments. For mothers like Agnes, who saw their children grow gaunt and weak, every passing shadow, every sniffle became a harbinger of doom. Constant struggle for sustenance, the perpetual worry about the next meal, cast a long, dark shadow over their lives. Fear of hunger was not just an economic concern, it was a deeply personal, heartbreaking fear for the lives of their little ones. Fields, which should have been sources of life, often became symbols of death, especially when the harvests failed. The mothers of 1085 were devastated by famine's cruel grip, which stole their children not with a sudden blow, but with a slow, agonizing drain of life, leaving them with the haunting image of their children's hollow eyes and fragile forms. The empty pantry was not just a lack of food, it was a grave dug before its time, a place where children's hopes and mothers' dreams withered away, never to blossom. Number 3, the perilous journey of birth and infancy. The very beginning of life in 1085 was fraught with unimaginable peril, not just for the mother, but profoundly so for the newborn child. The journey from conception to the first few years of life was a treacherous path, riddled with dangers that today seem almost unthinkable. For mothers, this period was an emotional roller coaster of hope, agonizing fear, and often profound devastation. The mysteries of birth were largely ununderstood, and the simplest complications could turn a joyous occasion into a tragic one, stealing a child away before they had even truly known the world. Consider the story of Marie, a young woman living in a modest dwelling in a bustling market town. She had endured a long and arduous pregnancy, marked by constant nausea and bone-deep fatigue. Her first child had been born lifeless, a silent, still burden that had left her with a grief so heavy she thought it would crush her. Now, as the contractions began, a mix of hope and terror gripped her. She knew the dangers intimately. Childbirth was not just painful, it was an extreme test of endurance for both mother and child, a passage through a perilous gate where death often stood sentinel. There were no trained physicians, no sterile instruments, no understanding of hygiene. Childbirth was almost exclusively handled by village midwives, women who passed down knowledge through generations, often relying on intuition, experience, and sometimes superstition. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night. The midwife, a kind but weary woman named Agnes, did her best, offering sips of herbal tea and murmured words of encouragement. Baby was not positioning correctly, and Marie's strength was ebbing. Air in the small room was thick with tension and the smell of sweat. Hours turned into a blur of pain and pushing. Finally, as dawn broke, a tiny, silent form emerged. It was a boy, but he was blue and still. Marie's heart leaped with a frantic, desperate hope, then plummeted into the cold abyss of despair. The midwife worked frantically, rubbing the tiny body, trying to coax a breath from its lungs, but it was to no avail. Baby, perhaps deprived of oxygen during the long labor, or suffering from some unseen internal fragility, simply did not breathe. Marie's cries were muffled by her aching throat, a sound of raw anguish that spoke of hopes dashed and dreams shattered before they could even take root. The loss of a child during childbirth was a devastation that left a permanent scar on a mother's soul, a void that could never truly be filled. It was the promise of life, held so close, yet snatched away before it could even utter a single cry. Even if a child survived the harrowing journey of birth, the first few weeks and months of infancy were equally precarious. Newborns were incredibly fragile, susceptible to a myriad of dangers. Without an understanding of germ theory, cleanliness was rudimentary. Umbilical cords cut with unsterilized knives and dressed with questionable poultices often became infected, leading to fatal cases of neonatal tetanus, a horrifying disease that caused spasms and rigidity, leaving the tiny body arched and stiff. Imagine a new mother, cradling her precious infant, who suddenly begins to twitch, then sees her tiny limbs contorted. There was nothing she could do but watch in agony as the disease took hold, the baby's cries turning into chilling moans, until silence descended once more. The feeling of helplessness in the face of such a terrifying and swift decline must have been utterly devastating. Infant feeding was another area fraught with danger. While breastfeeding was common, poor maternal nutrition could affect milk quality and quantity. If a mother died in childbirth or was too ill to nurse, a wet nurse might be sought, but the practice of animal milk feeding was primitive and often led to fatal digestive issues in infants, whose delicate systems could not process it. Imagine a mother whose milk dried up during a period of scarcity, or who fell ill. She would frantically search for a wet nurse, a desperate plea for another woman's life giving sustenance. One could not be found, or if the wet nurse herself was unhealthy, the infant faced starvation or illness from unsuitable alternatives. The despair of watching her newborn waste away, knowing she could not provide the most basic nourishment, was a burden of guilt and sorrow almost too heavy to bear. Furthermore, infants were vulnerable to sudden infant death, fevers, and the chill of inadequate warmth in poorly insulated homes. A mother might put her child to sleep, warm and seemingly content, only to find them cold and unresponsive in the morning. This sudden, unexplained loss, often attributed to evil spirits or divine judgment, left mothers reeling, searching for answers that did not exist, blaming themselves for what was an unavoidable tragedy in a world without medical understanding. The cumulative effect of these myriad infant perils was a constant state of anxiety for mothers. Every breath, every gurgle, every smile was precious, imbued with a fragility that made every moment of joy tinged with the possibility of sudden, heartbreaking loss. The first few years of life were a gauntlet, and for countless mothers in 1085, the journey of birth and infancy was a path paved with tears and devastation, leaving them with empty arms and forever broken hearts. Number 4. Unseen killers, filth and unsanitary conditions. In 1085, the invisible army of microbes thrived in plain sight, laying siege to the most vulnerable members of society. While people understood that illness could spread, they had no concept of microscopic organisms or the vital link between cleanliness and health. For mothers, this lack of knowledge translated into a silent, relentless war against unseen killers, one they were destined to lose, leaving them in a perpetual state of grief and devastation as their children succumbed to preventable diseases. The very air, water, and ground around them harbored agents of death, unknowingly brought into the home through everyday routines. Consider the typical dwelling in a medieval village. Homes were small, often with earthen floors, shared by both people and animals. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best. Human and animal waste might be tossed out into the street or collected in open pits, creating breeding grounds for flies, rats, and other vectors of disease. Water sources, whether a shared well or a river, were often contaminated by runoff from these very same waste areas. Imagine Alara, a young mother with 2 toddlers, Thomas and Lily. Their small hut, while cozy, was far from sterile. Chickens might wander in and out, leaving droppings. The communal well, their only source of water, was located downhill from the village latrines. Alara would draw water, seemingly clean, for drinking and cooking, unaware that it carried the unseen seeds of sickness. Children, who spent much of their time on the ground, exploring their surroundings with their hands and mouths, the risks were constant and high. They would play in the dirt, pick up stray objects, and inevitably transfer unseen pathogens into their system. Diarrheal diseases, like dysentery or cholera-like illnesses, were rampant, especially among infants and toddlers. These diseases, often caused by contaminated food or water, led to rapid dehydration and death in small children, whose tiny bodies could not withstand the severe fluid loss. Alara recalled the agony of watching Thomas, her robust, laughing boy, suddenly struck down by the flux. He had been playing by the stream earlier, splashing in the water, and just hours later, he was racked with fever and relentless purging. Alara, desperate, tried to give him sips of water, but it seemed to pass right through him. She held him as his strength drained away, his once bright eyes becoming dull and sunken, his skin clammy. The helplessness she felt was overwhelming, a burning anguish at her inability to stem the tide of the invisible poison consuming her son. When he finally went still in her arms, her scream was a testimony to the devastation that unsanitary conditions silently wrought. Skin infections were also a constant threat. Without proper bathing or access to clean clothing, cuts and scrapes, common occurrences for active children, easily became infected. These infections, if left untreated, could lead to blood poisoning, or even more severe diseases like erysipelas or cellulitis, which could quickly turn fatal in children. Imagine a child who scrapes their knee during play. What might be a minor injury today, easily cleaned and bandaged, could become a deadly wound in 1085. A mother like Alara would apply a poultice of herbs, perhaps some spiderwebs, but with no understanding of antiseptics, the infection would often fester, spreading through the child's body. Fever would rise, the limb would swell, and the child would suffer immense pain, eventually succumbing to the rampant infection. The feeling of watching her child suffer, knowing she could do nothing to stop the creeping poison, was a profound and agonizing devastation. Even routine tasks like food preparation contributed to the spread of illness. Food was often stored without refrigeration, exposed to flies and rodents. Meat, if not thoroughly cooked, could harbor parasites or bacteria. Vegetables, if not washed, could carry contaminants from the soil. A meal intended to nourish could inadvertently become a source of fatal illness. For mothers who toiled tirelessly to provide for their families, this insidious danger was a cruel irony. They would lovingly prepare meals, unaware that the very food they offered could be the cause of their child's suffering. Constant presence of disease, fostered by the lack of hygiene and sanitation, meant that childhood itself was a battleground. Mothers were perpetually on guard, their hearts in their throats with every cough, every stomach ache, every rash. The cumulative effect of these invisible killers, allowed to flourish by the prevailing conditions, was a landscape of grief, where every mother lived with the haunting possibility of losing another child to the unseen threats lurking in the very fabric of their daily lives. Devastation was not just in the loss, but in the powerlessness, the crushing knowledge that something unseen, something unexplainable, was constantly lurking, ready to snatch away the precious lives they so desperately tried to protect. Number 5. Accidents in a hardscrabble world. Life in 1085 was not just a battle against disease and hunger. It was a daily struggle against the environment itself, and accidents were an ever-present, terrifying threat, especially for the active, inquisitive, and often unsupervised children. For mothers, the sudden, violent nature of accidental death added another layer of unimaginable devastation, often leaving them with profound guilt and the torment of what-ifs. In a world without safety regulations, where homes were simple and dangerous, and daily life involved constant interaction with perilous tools and surroundings, a child's natural curiosity could lead to instant tragedy. Imagine a small rural home, built of timber and mud, with an open hearth at its center. This fire, essential for warmth and cooking, was also a deadly hazard. Children drawn to its flickering light and warmth could easily stumble into it, suffering catastrophic burns. Consider the plight of Johanna, a young mother with two energetic boys, 6-year-old Finn and 4-year-old Kale. While she was busy tending to the meager evening meal over the open fire, Kale, chasing a stray cat, tripped and fell directly into the glowing embers. Johanna's scream was primal, an immediate horror. She snatched him out, but the damage was done. Burns were deep and widespread, particularly on his small hands and face. There was no medical knowledge of how to treat such injuries beyond applying cooling poultices of herbs, which offered little relief or protection from infection. Johanna watched in agony as Kale writhed in pain, his skin blistering, his small body consumed by fever. The infection, an inevitable consequence in a time without proper wound care, set in quickly. She held him, rocking him, whispering prayers, feeling the heat radiate from his tiny body, a constant, searing reminder of the accident. Devastation for Johanna was not just the physical pain Kale endured, but the crushing guilt, the tormenting thought that if only she had watched him more closely, if only she had cleared the floor better, if only. Fire, the source of life, had become the instrument of death, stealing her son in a flash of agonizing pain, leaving her with the bitter ash of despair and a heart scorched by what she perceived as her own failure. Water bodies, too, were silent killers. Rivers, ponds, and even the simple village well, vital for survival, posed an enormous drowning risk to unsupervised children. In a world without swimming lessons or secure fencing, children were often left to play near these dangerous areas while their parents toiled in the fields or performed household chores. A mother laboring over a washtub might hear a splash, followed by a terrifying silence. Anne, a young woman living by a winding stream, had allowed her 3-year-old daughter, Lyra, to play near its banks, gathering pebbles. Lyra, with her bright, inquisitive eyes and boundless energy, was usually so careful. The bank was slippery from recent rain, and a single misstep was all it took. Anne heard the small cry, then the splash. She ran, her heart pounding, her stomach lurching, but the current was swift. By the time men from the village pulled Lyra from the water, her small body was limp and cold. Anne's world shattered in that moment. Devastation of watching her child, so full of life just moments before, taken by the silent, unforgiving water, was a grief that knew no bounds. She would forever hear that single splash, forever see the dark, swirling water, forever be haunted by the vision of her daughter's wet, still form. Omnipresent danger of water, essential for life, became a source of unparalleled sorrow. Even everyday tools and activities presented grave risks. Agricultural implements, livestock, falling objects from rudimentary shelters, carts traversing uneven roads, all were potential instruments of tragedy. A child might wander into a field where a cart was being loaded, or get too close to an irritable ox. Falls from trees or simple structures, head injuries from playful tumbles, or even accidental poisoning from foraging for unknown berries in the woods were all possibilities. For a mother in 1085, every day was a tightrope walk of worry. Constant threat of accidental death was not just a theoretical danger, but a lived reality, a grim reminder that life was fragile and fleeting, especially for the innocent. The suddenness of these losses, the lack of warning, the sheer randomness, left mothers utterly devastated, grappling with a grief that offered no closure, only an endless cycle of agonizing regret and the chilling knowledge that, despite their best efforts, they could not shield their children from the perilous realities of a hardscrabble world. Devastating toll of accidents in 1085 meant that a mother's vigilance, no matter how constant, was often not enough to save her beloved child from the swift, unyielding hand of fate. Number 6. The vicious cycle of poverty. In 1085, for many mothers, poverty was not merely a state of want. It was a vicious, unrelenting force that directly contributed to the mortality of their children, creating a cycle of deprivation and grief from which there was little escape. This pervasive destitution stripped families of even the most basic defenses against illness and hunger, leaving mothers with a profound, bitter devastation born of their inability to provide and protect. Poverty was an invisible cage, trapping families in a constant state of vulnerability. Consider the family of Isabel, a widow struggling to raise her 3 children in a small, damp hovel on the outskirts of a bustling town. Her husband had died 2 years prior, leaving her with no land, no savings, and only the meager income she could earn from sporadic day labor, spinning wool or cleaning for wealthier households. Eldest 7-year-old Arthur was already working, trying to help, but his small earnings barely kept them from outright starvation. 5-year-old Clara and infant baby Alara were entirely dependent on Isabel's meager efforts. In an era without social safety nets, a lost harvest, the death of a breadwinner, or a sudden illness could plunge a family into unimaginable depths of destitution. The most immediate impact of poverty was on nutrition. Isabel's family rarely had enough to eat. Their diet was monotonous and insufficient, consisting mainly of thin gruel, supplemented by whatever roots or scraps they could forage. Clara, once a lively girl, became listless and gaunt. Her skin was dry and her hair sparse. Isabel watched, her heart aching, as Clara grew weaker each day, her once bright eyes hollowed by hunger. Isabel would often give her own small portion to her children, feeling the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, but knowing it was far worse for their fragile bodies. She felt the heavy burden of responsibility, the crushing guilt that she simply could not provide enough to keep them nourished. When Clara succumbed to a fever that a well-fed child might have easily fought off, Isabel's devastation was absolute. It was not just the loss of her child, but the agonizing knowledge that if only she had had more food, if only they had not been so poor, perhaps Clara might still be alive. Poverty was not just a lack of coins, it was a lack of life itself. Housing conditions were another devastating consequence of poverty. Poor families lived in cramped, unhygienic dwellings, often with inadequate ventilation, earthen floors, and leaky roofs. These conditions provided ideal breeding grounds for disease. Dampness led to respiratory illnesses, and the lack of sanitation meant that infections spread rapidly. Isabel's hovel was perpetually cold and damp, especially in winter. Baby Alara, already weakened by poor nutrition, developed a persistent cough that soon turned into a rattling in her chest. Isabel bundled her in thin rags, desperate to keep her warm, but the cold seeped in from the mud walls and earth floor. She heard the baby's ragged breathing, a sound that tore at her soul, and knew that the damp, the cold, the very poverty that defined their existence was slowly stealing her youngest child. The infant's cries grew weaker, until one frigid morning, the silence that greeted Isabel was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. Cold, the lack of warmth and comfort, the dampness that clung to every corner of their impoverished home, had claimed another child, leaving Isabel with a profound, desolate devastation. Furthermore, poverty limited access to even the rudimentary remedies available at the time. While there were no doctors in the modern sense, wealthier families might be able to afford the services of a local herbalist or a bone setter. Poor families had no such recourse. When illness struck, they were left to their own devices, often relying on prayers and folk remedies that were ineffective against severe conditions. Isabel could only offer her children sips of water and whispered prayers, watching helplessly as fevers raged and bodies wasted away. The inability to seek even the most basic help, the feeling of utter powerlessness in the face of suffering, added a layer of crushing despair to her grief. The cycle of poverty was relentless. Children who survived the harsh realities of childhood malnutrition and disease were often stunted, weakened, and more susceptible to illness throughout their lives, perpetuating the cycle of vulnerability into adulthood. For mothers in 1085, the devastation caused by poverty was not just the single, acute loss of a child, but the constant, grinding anxiety, the gnawing guilt, and the bitter knowledge that their inability to escape the chains of destitution directly imperiled the lives of their precious little ones. It was a silent, systemic killer, robbing mothers of their joy, their hope, and their children, leaving them with hearts shattered by the brutal reality of their circumstances. Number 7. Limited knowledge and desperate cures. In 1085, facing the myriad threats to their children's lives, mothers operated within a world utterly devoid of modern medical understanding. The absence of knowledge about human anatomy, disease causation, hygiene, and effective treatments meant that illnesses and injuries, easily treatable today, often became fatal. For mothers, this stark reality led to desperate attempts at cures, often based on superstition or ineffective remedies, leaving them with the agonizing devastation of watching their children suffer and die, powerless in their profound ignorance. The very concept of medicine was deeply intertwined with religion, magic, and fragmented folk traditions. Consider the common understanding of illness. People believed diseases were caused by imbalances of humors in the body, divine punishment for sins, curses from witches, or the influence of evil spirits. When a child fell ill, the focus was often on spiritual remedies, prayers, pilgrimages, or appeasing angry deities, rather than on tangible treatments for the physical ailment. Imagine a young mother, Isolde, whose infant son, Finn, began to suffer from persistent convulsions, perhaps a sign of epilepsy or severe meningitis. Isolde, terrified, would first turn to prayer, lighting candles at the local church, begging for divine intervention. She might then seek the advice of the village priest, who would offer blessings and suggest a pilgrimage to a holy site. These actions, while offering spiritual comfort, did nothing to address the underlying physical condition that was slowly taking Finn's life. Isolde's heart would be torn between her faith and the terrifying reality of her son's worsening state, culminating in the deep devastation of his eventual demise, leaving her to question divine justice and her own spiritual worthiness. Herbal remedies were the primary form of medicine, passed down through generations. While some herbs possessed genuine medicinal properties, their efficacy was often limited, and their administration was imprecise. There was no concept of dosage, active ingredients, or potential side effects. A mother might give her child a concoction of herbs to treat a fever, unaware that the dosage was too small to be effective, or worse, that some ingredients were harmful. Imagine a child suffering from a high fever, perhaps due to pneumonia. The mother, desperate to bring down the heat, might administer various herbal teas and poultices. While these might offer some comfort, they would not address the bacterial infection ravaging the child's lungs. The child would continue to worsen, their breathing becoming labored, their body burning. The mother would watch, her hope diminishing with every passing hour, until the child's last breath, leaving her with the devastating knowledge that her best efforts were simply not enough, because the knowledge to truly fight the illness was beyond her reach. Superstition also played a significant role in desperate attempts to save children. Charms, amulets, and rituals were common practices. People might try to ward off evil spirits by placing specific objects under a child's bed or by murmuring ancient incantations. While these practices provided a psychological sense of agency for the desperate mother, they offered no real protection. A mother might believe that her child's illness was caused by the evil eye and would seek out someone to perform a ritual to break the curse. The ritual might involve spitting or burning herbs or specific gestures, but if the child was suffering from a severe infection, these these actions would be utterly useless. Crushing disappointment when the cure failed and the child continued to decline was a profound devastation, deepening the mother's sense of helplessness and fear. Even simple ailments, like a broken bone or a deep cut, were often mishandled due to lack of anatomical understanding and sterile practices. A bone setter might set a fracture incorrectly, leading to lifelong deformity or further complications. Deep cut treated with unsterile cloths or salves would inevitably become infected, leading to blood poisoning or gangrene. For mothers, seeing their child suffer from a simple injury that turned fatal due to lack of proper treatment was an unbearable torment. Devastating sight of a child's limb swelling, turning black and smelling foul, knowing that this simple injury was now a death sentence, was a testament to the brutal reality of limited medical knowledge. The cumulative effect of this ignorance was a society where children were constantly vulnerable, and mothers lived with a profound sense of powerlessness. They loved their children fiercely, they prayed fervently, and they tried every known remedy, but without the fundamental understanding of how the human body worked or how diseases truly spread, their efforts were often tragically futile. Devastating consequence of limited knowledge and desperate cures in 1085 was a relentless cycle of grief for mothers, watching their children suffer and die, unable to bridge the vast gap between their desperate love and the crushing realities of a world that held no answers for life's most precious gift. Number 8. The burden of war and social unrest. In 1085, the tapestry of life was often torn by the brutal threads of war and social unrest. While direct combat usually targeted adult men, the ripple effects of conflict were devastating for children and, by extension, their mothers. War did not just mean battlefields. It meant displacement, starvation, disease, and the breakdown of communities, creating a grim environment where child mortality soared. For mothers, the burden of war was not a distant abstract. It was an immediate, terrifying reality that directly stole their children, leaving them with a unique, profound devastation born of violence and chaos. Imagine a peaceful village nestled in a valley, its fields fertile, its people living out their lives by ancient rhythms. Suddenly, rumors begin to spread, then scouts appear, and finally, the dread reality of an approaching army. Whether it was the retinues of warring feudal lords, incursions from external invaders, or the localized violence of bandits and raiders taking advantage of instability, the outcome for civilians, particularly mothers and children, was often catastrophic. The immediate danger was direct violence, though less common for children than adults, but even more pervasive were the indirect consequences. For mothers, the first devastating blow was often forced displacement. When an army approached, families had to flee their homes, leaving behind their meager possessions, their stored food, and the safety of their familiar surroundings. Consider the mother, Lena, and her 4 young children, forced to abandon their small farm as news of an invading force spread. They might have only minutes to gather what they could carry, a few blankets, a loaf of bread, and a handful of dried meat. The journey itself was perilous. Small children unaccustomed to long treks would quickly grow tired, their small legs aching, their feet blistering. They faced exposure to the elements, sleeping outdoors with no shelter, susceptible to rain, cold, and the relentless sun. For Lena, every weary step of her children, every weak cry of hunger, every feverish cough was a stab to her heart. She carried the youngest, a babe barely a year old, her arms aching, her own body exhausted, but the fear for her children kept her moving. The stress, the lack of food and water, the constant fear of discovery weakened their already fragile immune systems. Devastation of displacement was not just the loss of their home, but the agonizing sight of her children suffering, their resilience slowly eroding under the relentless pressure of forced migration. Then came the specter of starvation. Armies on the march often lived off the land, requisitioning or simply seizing food from villages in their path. Fields could be deliberately burned, granaries looted, and livestock driven away, leaving a scorched earth policy that deprived the civilian population of their very means of survival. Lena, after weeks of wandering, finally found a temporary refuge in a crowded, besieged town. Food was scarce, rations were meager, and prices for what little was available soared far beyond her means. She watched her children grow thin, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, the very same signs she had seen in her neighbor's children during a bad harvest. This hunger was different. It was born of man's cruelty, not nature's caprice. She remembered her son, 8-year-old Eric, usually so boisterous, sitting silently, clutching his empty stomach. Guilt, the agonizing helplessness of not being able to feed her starving children, was a devastation that gnawed at her soul, a burning indictment of the brutal indifference of conflict. Disease, the ever-present companion of war, then swept through the displaced populations. Crowded refugee camps or besieged towns, with poor sanitation and weakened inhabitants, were perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. Dysentery, typhus, and measles ravaged the already vulnerable, claiming lives that had survived the initial violence and starvation. Lena's youngest, the babe she had carried for so long, succumbed to the flux in the crowded, fetid conditions of the refugee camp. She had watched, heartbroken, as the tiny life she had struggled so desperately to preserve slipped away, a victim not of a sword, but of the invisible, deadly consequences of war's shadow. Devastation was compounded by the chaos, the lack of resources, the inability to mourn properly, all contributing to a profound and aching sorrow. Furthermore, social unrest could lead to increased banditry and lawlessness, making travel unsafe and disrupting trade, further exacerbating food shortages and creating a climate of fear. For mothers, this meant a constant state of anxiety for their children's safety, both from direct harm and from the indirect consequences of a society in disarray. The world around them, once predictable, became a chaotic, dangerous place. The burden of war and social unrest was a heavy one for mothers in 1085. Stripped them of their homes, their sustenance, their safety, and most devastatingly, their children, leaving them with hearts shattered by the brutal realities of human conflict, a constant reminder of how easily peace and life could be extinguished by the flames of discord. Number 9. Vulnerable bodies, harsh environment. In 1085, the world itself was a formidable adversary for children, and by extension for their mothers. Beyond diseases, hunger, accidents, and social strife, the simple, relentless power of the natural environment, combined with the inherent vulnerability of young bodies, exacted a devastating toll. Children, with their developing physical forms and limited resilience, were disproportionately affected by extremes of weather, lack of adequate shelter, and the general hardships of daily life in a pre-industrial era. For mothers, this meant a constant battle against the elements, a fight where the odds were often stacked against them, leading to profound and often inexplicable devastation. Consider the brutal reality of winter. Houses in 1085 were typically small, drafty, and poorly insulated. Heating came from an open hearth, which provided warmth but also filled the air with smoke and presented a fire hazard. Infants and young children, whose bodies struggled to regulate temperature, the cold was a deadly threat. Imagine Alara, a young mother, huddled with her 3 children in their small, smoky hut during a particularly harsh winter. The wind whistled through gaps in the wattle and daub walls, and the earthen floor was perpetually cold. Her youngest, a baby barely a year old, developed a persistent cough and fever. Alara wrapped the infant in every spare scrap of woolen cloth she possessed, trying to warm its tiny body by the meager fire, but the cold seeped into its bones. Children's lungs, delicate and undeveloped, were highly susceptible to respiratory infections, and the damp, cold, smoky air of winter homes provided a perfect breeding ground for pneumonia and bronchitis. Alara watched, helpless, as her baby struggled for each breath, its tiny chest heaving. Devastation of seeing her child succumb to the relentless cold, to the very air they breathed, was a unique torment, a profound sorrow born of the environment's unforgiving nature. She knew she had done all she could, but the cold, unseen, and unyielding had taken her child. Conversely, the relentless heat of summer could also be a killer. While less frequently depicted, heatstroke and severe dehydration were threats, especially during periods of drought when water was scarce and the sun beat down relentlessly. Children, with their smaller body mass and higher metabolic rates, were more prone to overheating. A mother might find her child listless and unresponsive after a day in the fields, suffering from the sun's silent, burning assault. The lack of understanding about hydration, combined with limited access to clean water during hot periods, meant that even a child suffering from a common summer ailment like diarrhea could quickly dehydrate to a fatal degree. Devastation for a mother, seeing her child simply wither and fade under the sun's merciless gaze, was a quiet, agonizing form of grief, a poignant testament to the environment's power to steal life. Beyond temperature extremes, the very terrain could pose a constant threat. Unpaved, uneven roads, dense forests, and rocky landscapes meant that even simple travel could lead to injury. Children, with their boundless energy and less developed coordination, were prone to falls, leading to broken bones or head injuries that could easily prove fatal in an age without emergency medical care. A mother might send her older child to fetch water from a distant well, only for them to return with a twisted ankle that festered into a deadly infection or a severe head wound from a tumble. The environment, a daily companion, was also a silent killer, claiming children through its unrelenting harshness. Furthermore, the prevalence of wild animals posed a significant threat. Wolves, wild boars, and even stray dogs could attack children, especially in rural areas where the boundaries between human habitation and wilderness were blurred. A mother might send her child to gather firewood at the edge of the forest, only for them to encounter a hungry predator. Terror of such an encounter, and the subsequent devastation of finding her child mauled and lifeless, was a horrifying reality for some mothers, a stark reminder that even the natural world, so vital for sustenance, also harbored lethal danger. The cumulative effect of these environmental challenges, combined with the inherent vulnerability of young bodies, meant that children in 1085 were constantly at risk. Mothers lived with a perpetual state of vigilance, trying to shield their children from the invisible cold, the oppressive heat, the rough terrain, and the lurking dangers of the wild. But often their efforts were insufficient, pitted against forces too great to control. Devastation for mothers in 1085 was not just in burying their children, but in the agonizing knowledge that their precious little ones were born into a world where the very elements and surroundings could, and often did, claim their lives, leaving them with an emptiness that echoed the vast, unforgiving landscape.